Welcome to the debate. Our focus today, well, it's on fundamental grammar, specifically looking at one of the most, let's say, intriguing unwritten rules in English. This comes from our source material on the parts of speech. The material details how we tend to place multiple adjectives before a noun, and it outlines this highly complex sequence that almost every native speaker follows instinctively. Opinion, size, physical quality, shape, age, color, origin, material, type, and finally purpose. The video we looked at even frames this order as a kind of sneaky secret and calls it the key to fluency.
Yeah. It is remarkable, isn't it, that something seemingly so structurally rigid is just picked up, acquired, without any conscious teaching.
Exactly. And, well, that observation brings us right to the heart of our debate today. What is the true grammatical status of this natural adjective order? Is this 10-point sequence a fundamental structural grammatical rule that's actually essential for achieving fluency? Or perhaps, is it better understood simply as a profound descriptive observation of a linguistic tendency? A pattern maybe dictated more by cognitive habits. I'll be arguing that its fixed nature and the consequences of, well, getting it wrong, solidify its status as a structural rule, a rule that I think must be consciously understood by the serious language learner.
Right. And I'll be taking a different stance. I want to challenge that classification as a purely structural rule. I really question whether something so deeply intuitive, so ingrained, should be codified as a prescriptive rule that needs to be learned by rote. My position is that, while understanding this order as a strong tendency, perhaps rooted in cognitive principles, actually offers a more accurate view of English grammar than demanding learners memorize a 10-point list.
Okay, so my position really rests on the undeniable evidence of usage. This sequence acts like a structural law because any deviation is instantly recognized as, well, unidiomatic or sounding non-native. Consider the examples given in the material. A beautiful brown leather suitcase sounds perfectly fine, right? But reversing just two categories, a brown beautiful leather suitcase, it just sounds inherently wrong, doesn't it? The very existence of this apparently fixed 10-point hierarchy, spanning all the way from subjective opinion down to objective purpose, I think it proves it's not just accidental. For the learner, this explicit structure is the blueprint, the guide for natural usage. It's pretty indispensable if you want to produce complex, correct phrases like a big black Indian cooking pot. If violating it makes your speech sound unnatural, then the underlying structure must function as a rule.
Okay, I see that point, but I think we need to distinguish here between what is required to sound native and what is required to be grammatically correct in a prescriptive sense. Yes, the violation sounds unnatural. That's a fair observation. But that doesn't automatically mean the structure is a prescriptive rule that learners absolutely must memorize. If a linguistic system is acquired almost universally and unconsciously, so much so that, as the source notes, native speakers are genuinely blown away when they see the codified list, well, doesn't that suggest this order functions more like an internal constraint on how we process language? Perhaps it's related to, the acoustic weight of the adjectives, or maybe their semantic distance from the noun they modify. The rule, if you want to call it that, seems buried deep in the cognitive structure, not laid out in a textbook mandate. And focusing on that distinction, constraint versus mandate, if this complex ordering is used without conscious awareness, shouldn't we perhaps be looking more towards, say, psycholinguistics for the real explanation, rather than just creating a pedagogical list for learners? There's research suggesting we order adjectives based on qualities like semantic closeness to the noun. Purpose is obviously very close, opinion is quite distant, or even things like acoustic salience may be shorter, more common adjectives tend to shift closer to the noun. This all points towards the order being more of a neurological efficiency measure, perhaps, not a purely syntactical decree handed down. How can consciously learning a rule truly replicate something that seems fundamentally intuitive, maybe even non-syntactical in origin?
I have to push back a bit on your framing there.
This idea of innate constraint versus structural rule, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. A structural rule in language often does derive from cognitive efficiency, doesn't it? But for the non-native speaker who's trying to replicate the system from the outside, well, mapping that unconscious constraint onto conscious knowledge is often the only practical path forward. We catalog the 10 points precisely because the learner can't just rely on, millennia of cognitive evolution like a native speaker can. If the learner doesn't consciously know that size generally precedes age, they might randomly produce something like new big car, which clearly violates the fixed structural relationship we hear in the correct big new car. Cataloging the sequence, it allows the learner to consciously build the necessary correct internal syntax. That's the key, I think.
And the sheer granularity of the list itself, I think, speaks to the rigor of this structural pattern or law. I mean, why bother separating size, physical quality, shape, and age if it were just some kind of fluid tendency? The fact that the structure seems to demand this high level of differentiation, it demonstrates a deep, arguably non-negotiable hierarchy. We seem to be dealing with quite a precise grammatical location for 10 distinct types of descriptors. If the order were merely intuitive or loosely tendency-based, wouldn't you expect more fluidity or maybe a greater allowance for reversal, especially when categories seem close semantically? Yet reversing almost any adjacent pairing still generates an awkward, unnatural-sounding construction.
Okay, that's a compelling argument about the granularity, the detail. But let me challenge the premise that this detail automatically proves rigidity. Have you really considered the inherent ambiguity and potential overlap in some of those categories? For example, if I describe a table as sleek, is that physical quality or is it shape? They seem quite close. Or if I use running in running shoes, okay, that's clearly purpose. But what about tired and tired eyes? Is that age? Quality? It's not always clear-cut. The fact that context and interpretation allow for this kind of ambiguity, and the fact that the 10-point list itself needs careful definition to try and avoid overlap, well, it suggests to me that the structure is more of a post hoc description, an attempt to impose a kind of mathematical precision onto what might be a more probabilistic system. It feels like we're maybe forcing a rigid box onto a more fluid cognitive tendency.
If the rule were truly fixed and absolute, wouldn't the categories themselves be less ambiguous?
Right, so the essential question then, it comes back to pedagogical utility and this idea of fluency. The source material is, pretty unequivocal on this point, isn't it? Calling this sequence the key to fluency. Now, if we define fluency as speaking naturally, like a native speaker, and if breaking this adjective order instantly disrupts that native-like sound, then treating it as a strict rule or at least a very strong guideline seems like a necessary instructional step. It provides learners with an essential, almost fail-safe mechanism for constructing complex noun phrases correctly.
I see why you emphasize the consequence, the unnatural sound. But let me offer just a final distinction regarding practical fluency. In actual, everyday spoken English, let's be honest, complex sequences involving all 10 categories are exceedingly rare. I mean, we usually only string together maybe 2, 3, perhaps 4 adjectives at most. And often, they're drawn from just a few common categories, like size, age, and color. So therefore, requiring a learner to memorize and consciously classify adjectives against all 10 rigid steps just to achieve basic fluency, well, it might create unnecessary cognitive load. Maybe true fluency in this specific context is better served by teaching the most frequent patterns, like, say, color almost always follows size, as strong tendencies, rather than treating the entire 10-point hierarchy as some kind of inflexible, inviolable law. Overclassification, I worry, could actually stifle natural, spontaneous speech.
To summarize my view, the adjective order is demonstrably rule-like because the consequences of violating it are systemic. It consistently results in unnatural language every time it's tested. The very capability to catalog and define this precise 10-point sequence, stretching from opinion, the most subjective, all the way to purpose, the most objective, proves, I believe, that there is a fixed underlying structure to English syntax, And it's a structure the learner must master to reach genuine fluency, regardless of whether a native speaker actively thinks about it or not.
And from my perspective, while the observed preference for sequencing adjectives is, well, undeniable, especially common pairings like size before color, as in big black, the extreme level of detail provided, that full 10-step list, is probably best viewed as a meticulously constructed descriptive model. It's a tool used to explain a natural cognitive tendency, rather than representing a hard and fast prescriptive grammatical law that must be memorized. Understanding this distinction, I think, between a strong tendency, likely driven by semantic grouping or cognitive factors, and a prescriptive learnable rule is really vital for appreciating how human language truly operates and, importantly, how it's acquired.
So we've explored whether this profound intuitive structure governing adjective ordering is best categorized as a strict structural rule or perhaps as a deep linguistic tendency. It certainly highlights a productive tension between the observed mechanics of speech and the practical needs of conscious language instruction.
Absolutely. And there is clearly much more to explore in the fundamental building blocks of spoken English, particularly how these innate cognitive preferences might become, over time, codified within the grammar itself.